The coffee was still hot when Jane Conley asked the question that split the morning wide open. She had not planned it. She had not rehearsed it in front of the small cracked mirror above the wash basin, had not weighed the words carefully the way she weighed everything else in her life, every measurement of flour, every calculation of grazing acreage, every angle of a rifle sight. It simply came out of her, quiet and direct, the way water finds the lowest crack in stone. "Why have you not planted the north pasture?" she said. "4 years of fallow ground, Clarence, 4 years." The fork in Clarence Blackwell's hand stopped moving. It hovered somewhere between the plate and his mouth, and Jane watched the shift in his jaw, the way the muscle there tightened like a rope pulled too fast through a pulley. She watched his eyes drop to the table, and in 23 years of reading men and horses and weather, she had never seen anything collapse so completely in a single breath. He set the fork down. The sound of iron on the ceramic plate was the loudest thing in the kitchen. He had not said a word. And yet Jane already understood, with the brutal clarity that had always been both her gift and her curse, that whatever lived in those 4 unplanted years was not a small thing. It was not about the soil quality. It was not about drought years or cattle prices or a broken plow. It was something that lived inside Clarence Blackwell the way certain poisons live inside a body, quiet and systemic, doing their damage in the dark. "Clarence," she said, and her voice was softer now, not because she was retreating but because she recognized the weight of what she had struck. He looked up at her. And then Clarence Blackwell, the hardest man in Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, a man who had pulled a longhorn steer out of a ravine with his bare hands, a man who had negotiated with cattle rustlers twice his number without flinching, a man who had survived things that would have unmade lesser people entirely, opened his mouth and told her everything he had never said. It would take Jane the rest of that morning, and most of the afternoon, and the full, terrible length of a sleepless night, to understand the true shape of what he gave her at that table. But the beginning was enough to lock her in her chair. The beginning was enough to change everything. It had started, as most catastrophes do, 4 years before. Jane Conley had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1881, and she had arrived on her own terms, which was the only way she had ever arrived anywhere. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a land surveyor who had raised her in the New Mexico high country after her mother died of typhoid fever when Jane was 7. Her father, a meticulous and deeply loving man named Robert Conley, had taught her everything he knew, which was considerably more than most men twice his age. He taught her to read topographic maps and shoot a Winchester repeating rifle and track weather systems by the behavior of scrub jays. He taught her to survey land with a transit and a measuring chain, to calculate acreage and elevation and soil composition, and to do it with a precision that would have made most professional surveyors in the territory feel quietly ashamed of themselves. Robert Conley died of a heart attack in the winter of 1879, leaving Jane the surveying equipment, a small savings in a Santa Fe bank, and a complete and unsentimental understanding of how to survive in the high desert without leaning on anyone. She was hired by the Maxwell Land Grant Company in the spring of 1880 to conduct a boundary survey of contested ranch properties in Colfax County, a job that no one else wanted because the land disputes in that county had already produced a body count that made serious people nervous. The Lincoln County war to the south had grabbed all the newspaper attention, but the Colfax County range wars were grinding and ugly and not yet finished, and sending a woman surveyor into them was the kind of idea that the Maxwell Company's Eastern directors thought was quietly genius, because surely no one would shoot at a woman. They were wrong about that, of course, but Jane handled it. She had been working the Cimarron Basin for several months when she first had reason to ride past the Blackwell Ranch, which sat on a plateau south of the Cimarron River, with a view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that would have made a weaker person stop and simply stare. The ranch covered approximately 4,000 acres, a working cattle operation that had been built from raw land by Clarence Blackwell's father, Thomas, who had died in 1875 and left the whole enterprise to his only son. Jane's first encounter with Clarence Blackwell was not romantic in any conventional sense. She was standing at her transit, which she had set up at the northeast corner of a property line that was in active dispute between the Blackwell Ranch and a neighboring operation owned by a man named Gordon Price. She was in the middle of a very precise calculation involving the relationship between a limestone outcrop and a surveying stake that had apparently been moved, deliberately and recently, by someone who understood just enough about surveying to make trouble without understanding enough to do it convincingly. Jane had identified 3 separate errors in the repositioned stake and was in the process of documenting them in her field notes with the quiet satisfaction of a person who finds dishonesty not morally offensive so much as intellectually irritating. Clarence Blackwell rode up at a canter and pulled his horse to a stop approximately 15 feet from her transit. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of permanent weathering in his face that told you he had spent most of his adult life outdoors and had not spent much of it worrying about it. He was 31 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who carry heavy responsibilities often do. He was wearing a canvas work coat that had seen significant use and a hat that was battered in a functional rather than decorative way, and he looked at Jane and at her equipment with an expression that started as suspicion and progressed through confusion before settling somewhere in the vicinity of deeply uncertain. "You are on my land," he said. "I am on disputed land," Jane said without looking up from her notes, "which is precisely why I am here. Who sent you?" "The Maxwell Company. Though I will tell you, as I tell everyone, that my measurements belong to the truth regardless of who is paying me. If you have moved this stake, Mr. Blackwell, my report will say so." There was a pause. "I have not moved any stake," he said, and there was something in his voice that Jane registered even without looking at him, a flatness that was not the flatness of a lie but the flatness of a man who is genuinely offended. "Price moved it. He moved it 14 inches northeast sometime in the last 2 weeks. I have been waiting for someone to notice." Jane looked up then. She looked at him directly, which was something she did with everyone and which made most people uncomfortable, and she said, 14 inches, that is a very precise number. I paced it myself, then I measured it. With what instrument? A surveying chain, my father's. Jane studied him for a moment. Then she looked back at her notes, did a brief calculation, and said, 14¼ inches. You were a quarter inch off. Something changed in Clarence Blackwell's face. It was not quite a smile. It was more like a recalibration, the kind of adjustment a person makes when they have been preparing for one kind of conversation and discover they are actually in a different one entirely. "I will accept that correction," he said. "You are welcome to observe the rest of the survey if you wish," Jane said. "I have 2 more stakes to verify, and then I will be preparing the formal documentation. If your measurements agree with mine, it will strengthen the case considerably." He dismounted and he watched her work, and Jane was aware of being watched. But she was also aware that the watching was different from the kind of watching she usually received from men in the territory. There was no condescension in it. There was no amusement. There was something that she could only identify after some reflection as attention. Pure, focused, respectful attention. They did not exchange many more words that afternoon. But when Jane had finished and was breaking down her transit, he helped her load it onto her pack mule without being asked, with a care that told her he understood the value of precision instruments, and he said, "I appreciate the honest work, Miss Conley." "It is the only kind I do," she said. He nodded. He mounted his horse. He rode back toward his ranch house, and Jane stood for a moment watching him go, and felt something she could not immediately name settle somewhere in the lower portion of her chest. She told herself it was the satisfaction of a clean survey. She was not entirely convinced. The formal boundary dispute was resolved in Clarence's favor 3 weeks later when Jane's survey report was filed with the county land office. Gordon Price contested it, loudly and with significant profanity, but Jane had documented everything with the kind of thoroughness that left no room for argument, and the land office upheld the original boundary, which meant the north pasture of the Blackwell Ranch was confirmed as Blackwell property. Jane did not see Clarence again until the following week, when he appeared at the door of the small rented room she was keeping at the boarding house in Cimarron. He was holding his hat in his hands, which Jane noticed because it was the kind of gesture that men in the territory did not perform unless they were making a deliberate effort. "Miss Conley," he said, "I wanted to thank you properly. The north pasture is essential to my spring planting. Without it, I would have had to reduce the herd considerably." "You already thanked me," Jane said. "You said you appreciated the honest work." "I did, but I am saying it again." He paused. "I was wondering if you would consent to having dinner with me at the hotel restaurant. It is not much, but it is the best Cimarron has to offer." Jane looked at him steadily for a moment. She thought about the particular quality of his attention during the survey. She thought about the fact that he had measured the displaced stake himself and been off by only a quarter inch. She thought about the way he had handled her transit equipment with automatic care. "All right," she said. The dinner lasted 3 hours. They talked about land and cattle and New Mexico territory politics and the Maxwell land grant situation, which was complicated and unjust in ways that Jane had documented and that Clarence had been living with. They talked about the mountains and the way the high desert changed character between seasons, and about the practical mathematics of ranching, and about books, which both of them read more seriously than anyone around them expected. Clarence Blackwell was, Jane discovered, a man of considerable hidden depth. He was not verbose. He did not tell stories about himself in the way that men often did when they were trying to impress. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers with the same focused quality of attention he had given her work at the boundary stakes, and Jane found herself telling him things that she did not usually say to anyone, about her father, about the loneliness of the surveying work, about the way the territory had a violence in it that she had learned to navigate but had never fully stopped feeling. He told her in return that he had taken over the ranch at 21 after his father's death, that there had been a period of several years where he had not been certain the operation would survive, that he had made mistakes and learned from them, and made new ones and learned from those too. He said this without self-pity and without performance, and Jane recognized in it the voice of someone who had developed a genuine and hard-won relationship with the truth. She walked back to the boarding house that night with the high desert stars blazing above Cimarron, and the Sangre de Cristo range dark against the northwestern sky, and she knew she was in some variety of trouble. She had worked very hard to construct a life that did not require her to need anything from anyone. It was a good life. It was a competent, independent, intellectually satisfying life. The surveying work was real work that mattered, and she was better at it than anyone else in the territory, and she had a freedom that most women of her era could not imagine. She had been careful not to compromise any of that. And now she was walking back from a 3-hour dinner and thinking about the way Clarence Blackwell's eyes changed when he was listening to something that genuinely interested him. This was inconvenient. She stayed in Cimarron for 2 more weeks to complete the boundary work in the region, and Clarence found reasons to be in town on 3 separate occasions, and each time they talked for as long as circumstances allowed. He was not pushy about it. He did not press or perform or try to overwhelm her with attention. He was simply, consistently, present in the way that she had begun to notice she wanted him to be present. On her last evening in Cimarron before she was due to ride south toward Santa Fe for her next survey contract, he walked with her to the edge of the town, where the road curved south through the cottonwood trees along the river, and he stopped and looked at her with something in his face that he was clearly in the process of deciding whether to say. "You will come back through this way," he said finally. "Probably," she said. "The Maxwell Company has significant ongoing boundary work in this county. I would like to show you the ranch sometime, if you are willing." Jane looked at him. The cottonwood leaves moved in the evening wind, pale green and silver in the fading light. "I would like that," she said. She rode south the next morning, and she did not let herself think too much about it, because thinking too much about things that could not be controlled was a waste of precise mental energy, and Jane Conley had never been a woman who wasted her resources. But she thought about it anyway. She returned to Cimarron 6 weeks later for the second phase of the boundary survey work, and Clarence was standing outside the land office as though he had simply happened to be there, which they both understood was not the case. He walked her to the boarding house with her equipment, which she allowed because it was heavy and because she wanted to walk beside him. He showed her the ranch the following Sunday, and she spent 4 hours walking the land with him and asking questions about soil composition and water rights and grazing rotation. And he answered everything directly, and she told him 3 things he had not considered about the North Pasture in particular, regarding drainage patterns and soil pH. And he listened to all of it with an expression of complete absorption that she had begun to recognize as his natural state when something was genuinely interesting him. There was a moment, standing at the fence line between the North Pasture and the middle grazing ground, when the afternoon light came across the grass at a low angle, and the mountains were purple and gold behind them, and Clarence turned to say something and then did not say it, and they stood very close together for a moment that stretched and stretched. He kissed her the following week, after their 4th dinner at the hotel restaurant, standing outside under the stars of Cimarron, and it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had decided something and was not uncertain about it, and Jane kissed him back with the same quality of commitment. "I am not a woman who stays in one place," she told him afterward, stepping back enough to look at him clearly. "I need you to know that. My work takes me across the territory. I am not prepared to give that up." "I am not asking you to," he said. "I am asking you to come back." She looked at him for a long moment. "That I can do," she said. For the next 8 months they built something improbable and real in the spaces between her survey contracts and his ranching seasons. She came back to Cimarron and to the Blackwell ranch 7 times in those months, and each visit was different from the last and better than the previous. And the thing building between them was not the soft, vague feeling that Jane had always distrusted in romantic stories, but something dense and particular and specific, built out of actual conversations and genuine respect, and the discovery, again and again, that the other person was more interesting and more complex and more worth knowing than the previous encounter had suggested. Clarence planted the North Pasture in the spring of 1882, their first spring together in any real sense, and the crop came in well. Jane was there for the planting and she was there for part of the harvest, and she stood at the edge of that field in the September light, and felt something that she was beginning to recognize as the particular happiness of a life that was fitting into its right shape. He asked her to marry him at the North Pasture fence line on a Sunday afternoon in October 1882, in the same spot where they had stood close together in that first stretched moment the previous year. He did not have a speech prepared. He said that he had been trying to figure out the right words for 3 months, and had concluded that there were not any right words because what he wanted to say was not the kind of thing that language handled well, and that he loved her specifically, not generically, that he loved her mind and her capability and her particular kind of honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable but was always clean, and that he wanted her to stay, and that he understood what he was asking and what it would cost her, and that he thought they could build something that was worth the cost. Jane said yes. They were married in November 1882, in Cimarron, in a small service with the county judge because the nearest minister was in Taos, and Jane had no patience for the delay. She wore a dark blue dress she had bought in Santa Fe, and Clarence wore his best suit, and looked uncomfortable in it in a way that made Jane feel a disproportionate tenderness. They had dinner afterward at the hotel restaurant, the same restaurant where it had all begun, and they rode out to the ranch in the cold dark under a sky that was brilliant and enormous. She kept her surveying contracts. He never asked her not to. She was gone for stretches of 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 weeks, riding the territory with her transit and her measuring chains and her meticulous field notes. And when she came home, the ranch felt different and better than it had before she left. And Clarence was always there, steady and present and genuinely glad to see her in a way that had nothing needy in it. The North Pasture produced well in 1883. It produced well in the spring of 1884. And then, in the summer of 1884, a woman named Clara Maddox arrived in Colfax County. Clarence did not tell Jane about Clara Maddox for 4 years. This was not exactly a lie. It was more like a wound that he had covered over so many times that the covering had become structural, part of the architecture of how he moved through his days, and removing it was not a simple matter of deciding to be honest. It required a kind of courage that Clarence Blackwell had in great supply in almost every area of his life except this one. Clara Maddox had been Clarence's intended before Jane. Before the boundary survey, before the hotel dinners, before the specific and irreplaceable thing that had grown between him and Jane. Clara had come from a family in Texas that Thomas Blackwell had known, and in the year before Thomas's death, there had been an informal understanding between the families that Clara and Clarence would eventually marry. Clara was 20 when Thomas died and Clarence was 21, and taking over a ranch that was barely solvent, and the arrangement had been set aside by mutual consent, or so he had thought. Clara Maddox arrived in Colfax County in the summer of 1884 with her brother Edward, who was looking for land, and she came to call at the Blackwell Ranch, while Jane was away on a survey contract in the Taos Basin. She was a handsome woman, pleasant in manner, and she looked around the ranch house with an expression that Clarence recognized too late as proprietary. She said she was glad to see him well and prosperous. She said she had heard he had married. She said she hoped his wife was comfortable on a working ranch. There was nothing overtly threatening in any of it. But something in the visit settled into Clarence's chest like cold water, and when he told Jane about it, which he did, upon her return, he told her only the surface facts. He did not tell her about the history. He did not tell her about the understanding between the families, or about the particular way Clara Maddox had looked at the ranch house, or about the letter he had received, 2 weeks after the visit, from Edward Maddox, which was not a letter about land purchases at all. Edward Maddox's letter informed Clarence that Clara had told him about the engagement arrangement, a word that Clarence had never used in his own mind to describe what had existed between him and Clara. Edward informed him that Clara was in poor health, that she had counted on the security of the Blackwell Ranch, and that he, Edward, would be taking the matter up with a lawyer if Clarence was not prepared to make some arrangement for Clara's welfare. It was, in short, a shakedown, dressed in the language of family honor and obligation, but a shakedown nonetheless. Clarence did not tell Jane. He should have. He knew he should have. He knew it with the same clarity with which he knew everything that was true and important, but the calculus of his silence was complex and terrible. He was afraid that Jane would leave. Not because she was fragile or dependent or incapable of handling hard information, but precisely the opposite. Jane Conley was a woman who did not stay anywhere she did not choose to stay, and Clarence had built the last 2 years of his life around the fact that she had chosen to stay with him. The thought of introducing an uncertainty into that choice, even an uncertainty of his own making, was more frightening than anything the Maddox family could threaten. He paid Edward Maddox $300 in the fall of 1884 and did not plant the North Pasture that spring, because he could not look at it without feeling the weight of what he had done and what he had not said. The $300 was money he had intended for seed and equipment. It was not a catastrophic sum, but it was significant on a ranch that operated on narrow margins. He did not plant the North Pasture in 1885, or 1886, or 1887. Every spring he would stand at the fence line and look at that ground and feel the accumulated silence pressing on him like stone. And every spring the planting did not happen, because the not planting had become the most honest expression he had of the thing he was carrying, even though it was a dishonest expression in every other sense. Edward Maddox came back twice in those 4 years, each time with an escalating number and each time Clarence paid, because the alternative, as he understood it in his most frightened mind, was the destruction of the thing he loved most. He was wrong about that. He came to understand he was wrong about that on the morning that Jane asked him why he had not planted the North Pasture, and he set down his fork, and he told her everything. The telling took more than an hour. Jane sat across the breakfast table and did not interrupt him. This was, for her, an enormous effort, because she had things she wanted to say at multiple points, and she was not generally a person who withheld her responses. But she recognized that Clarence was doing something that was costing him significantly, and she had enough respect for difficult work to let him finish it. When he stopped talking, the kitchen was very quiet. The sound of the wind outside against the walls of the ranch house was the only movement in the world. Jane got up and poured herself a second cup of coffee. She stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment, and Clarence sat at the table with the expression of a man who has just put everything he has on a table and does not yet know whether he will get to keep any of it. She turned around. "How much did you pay him in total?" she said. $740, Clarence said, across 3 separate payments. Jane set her coffee cup down on the counter and folded her arms, not in a defensive posture but in the posture of a person who is thinking very precisely. "And you believe this constitutes a legal claim," she said. "I did not know what I believed. I knew it felt like." "It is not a legal claim," Jane said. "An informal family understanding between your father and another family, with no written contract, no formal engagement announcement, no witnesses of record, and abandoned by both parties before any public commitment was made, does not constitute a legal claim. There is no court in New Mexico territory that would recognize it. Edward Maddox knew this. He has been extorting you." Clarence looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I know it now. I knew it then in the part of myself that thinks clearly, but the part of myself that was afraid." "What were you afraid of?" she said, and her voice had gone softer again. He was quiet for a long moment. "You," he said. "I was afraid of you, of what you would think, of what you would decide." Jane stood very still. "You thought I would leave," she said. "I thought you might. You were always clear that you stayed by choice, that you could leave. I was afraid that if I gave you a reason to question the choice." "Clarence," her voice stopped him. It was not harsh, but it had a quality of absolute directness. "I stayed by choice, that is correct. And do you know what the choice was based on?" He waited. "It was based on who I believed you to be," she said, "which was a man who dealt in the truth, a man who was honest even when honesty was not the easiest route. If you had told me about the Maddox situation in 1884, I would not have left. I would have been angry. I would have told you exactly what I am telling you now, which is that it is not a valid legal claim, and that Edward Maddox is a criminal in the practical sense, if not the literal one. And then we would have handled it." "I know," he said, and his voice was low and carrying more weight than she had ever heard it carry. "What you did by not telling me," Jane said, "was take my choice away from me. You decided what information I was capable of receiving and how I would respond to it, and you were wrong on both counts. You kept a secret from me for 4 years. You paid money we needed to plant that field, and you left that ground fallow as a kind of penance that I was not allowed to understand." There was a long pause. "Yes," Clarence said, "and Edward Maddox may come back. He may." Jane picked up her coffee cup and carried it to the table and sat down across from him again. She looked at him for a long moment, and he met her eyes and held them, which she could see was not easy. "I am angry," she said levelly. "I want you to understand that I am angry. I know. And I am not leaving. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence from the one before. It had a different density. Clarence let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. I need you to understand something, Jane said. I am not staying because I forgive you right now. I am staying because what we have built here is real, and because anger is not the same as a reason to leave, and because I am not a woman who makes decisions when she is angry. I am going to need some time. I understand, he said. But, Jane said, and she leaned forward slightly, we are going to deal with the Maddox situation today, and you are going to let me handle it because apparently when you handle it alone, you make it worse. Something moved across Clarence's face that was close to relief and close to shame, and had a thread of something else in it that Jane recognized after a moment as the particular quality of being known. All right, he said. Jane spent the morning in Clarence's office, which was a small room off the main parlor where he kept his ranch records and his correspondence. She read everything that Edward Maddox had written, all 3 letters, which Clarence produced from a locked box in the desk with the expression of a man surrendering weapons. She made notes in her clear, precise handwriting. She cross-referenced the letters with what she knew of New Mexico Territory law, which was considerable because surveying land disputes had required her to develop a working knowledge of property and contract law that most non-lawyers did not possess. What she found was exactly what she had told Clarence at the breakfast table. There was no legal basis for any claim. What there was, plainly and without ambiguity, was a pattern of correspondence designed to imply a legal threat where none existed, targeting a man who was emotionally vulnerable on the specific subject being threatened. It was, in the formal sense, extortion, and the fact that the amounts involved were not enormous did not change the nature of the act. She wrote a letter to Edward Maddox that afternoon. Clarence read it before she sealed it, and when he finished reading it, he sat for a moment with the pages in his hands and looked up at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was not admiration, though that was in it too. It was something more specific than either of those. It was the expression of a man who is watching someone be exactly and completely themselves in a way that leaves him entirely undone. The letter was calm, precise, and devastating. It laid out in plain and legal language the exact nature of the correspondence to date, the absence of any enforceable claim, the definition of extortion under territorial law, and the specific remedies available to the Blackwells if the correspondence continued. It cited 3 relevant legal statutes. It noted that copies of all previous correspondence had been retained. It suggested that Mr. Maddox might wish to consult legal counsel before responding, and that if he chose to respond in any way other than an acknowledgement of cessation, the matter would be referred to the Colfax County Sheriff. It was signed Jane Conley Blackwell. This is, Clarence started. I know, Jane said. Where did you learn to write a letter like this? Years of land disputes. You learn what the law is because the people who want to cheat you certainly know what it is. She paused. I should have been allowed to do this 4 years ago. That landed the way it was meant to land, and Clarence absorbed it without deflecting. Yes, he said, you should have. The letter went out on the afternoon stage to Taos, where Edward Maddox had established himself in a land speculation office. They did not have to wait long. 11 days later, a reply arrived, notable for its brevity, essentially acknowledging receipt, and containing no further demands. Clara Maddox's name did not appear in it. Jane doubted it ever would again. The silence that had been sitting over the North Pasture for 4 years lifted, not all at once, but in the way that heavy weather lifts, gradually and with intermittent returns, but trending unmistakably toward clear. The anger between Jane and Clarence was real, and they did not pretend otherwise. There were several evenings in the weeks after the breakfast conversation where the atmosphere in the ranch house was dense and difficult, where they moved around each other with the particular care of 2 people managing something fragile, and where certain conversations did not happen because neither of them was ready to have them yet. But there were also other evenings and mornings, and the particular intimacy of people who are sharing a hard thing honestly for the first time after a period of dishonest isolation. Clarence did not try to rush her forgiveness. He did not perform remorse in excessive or theatrical ways. What he did was be present and honest and consistent in a way that was, Jane thought, considerably harder than the performance would have been. He told her other things in that period. Things adjacent to the Maddox situation, and things not adjacent to it at all. Things about his father and the early years of the ranch, about the mistakes he had made and the fears he carried, about the loneliness of the years before she had come into his life, and the particular terror of having something to lose that you had not known was possible before. He told her these things not strategically, but with the awkward and genuine quality of a person who has discovered, through the painful experience of what secrets cost. That openness is the better accounting. Jane listened, and she talked, and she told him things she had not told him before, about the years after her father died, about the particular kind of solitude that is chosen but still has weight, about the night on the road to Santa Fe when she had been followed by two men she did not know and had to manage the situation with a rifle and a very clear voice and a great deal of self-possession, and how she had been more frightened afterward than during, and how she had never told anyone because there had been no one to tell. They were, in those weeks, doing something that they had been doing for 3 years and then had stopped doing, which was telling each other the truth. Forgiveness, when it came, did not arrive as a formal declaration. It arrived one evening in early April, 6 weeks after the breakfast conversation, when Clarence came in from a long day working the spring cattle and was dirty and tired in the complete way that physical labor produces. And Jane had dinner on the table and had also, without comment, drawn water for the bathing tub in the back room, because it had been a cold day and hot water was not nothing. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the table, at the lamp lit against the spring dark outside, at Jane moving competently around the kitchen, and something in his face went absolutely open. He said her name. Not to get her attention, not as a preamble to something else, just her name in a voice that had all of the weight and specificity of everything they were to each other. Jane turned from the stove and looked at him. "I know," she said. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, work coat and dirt and all, and held on, and he held her back with the particular intensity of a man who understands exactly what he is holding. After some time he said quietly, "I am sorry, Jane. Not for what Maddox did, for not trusting you. I know," she said again, "I will not do it again." "No," she said, "you will not." There was nothing soft or weak in how she said it, and he did not mistake it for anything other than what it was, which was a woman who meant what she said and expected it to be honored. He kissed her then, carefully and with great intention, and the kitchen was warm and the spring wind was moving outside and the north pasture was there in the dark beyond the window, waiting. They planted the north pasture in the second week of May, 1888. Jane was there for the planting, which she had arranged by delaying a survey contract that could wait a week without material consequence. She worked alongside Clarence from the first hour of the morning, because the planting of a field that has been fallow for 4 years is a significant undertaking, and extra hands are not ceremonial. The soil had compacted in the years of disuse and needed turning, and the drainage work that Jane had identified in her very first assessment of the property back in 1881, the work she had told Clarence about standing at this same fence line, turned out to be exactly as important as she had said it was. They spent 2 days on drainage correction before they could plant. Clarence watched her work the soil with a measuring rod and an instinct for landscape that came from years of reading land professionally, calling out adjustments and corrections, recalculating after each test with the focused efficiency that he had first observed standing at a displaced boundary stake in the summer of 1881, and that still, 7 years later, produced in him the same involuntary sense of witnessing something exceptional. On the second day, when the drainage corrected and the first rows of sorghum seed were going into the prepared ground, he stopped working for a moment and stood watching her work, and she looked up and caught him watching. "What?" she said. "You told me about that drainage on our first visit to the ranch," he said, "before we were anything to each other. I know. If I had planted this field in 1882 the way you said, with the corrections you identified, I would have had a significantly better yield." "Yes," she said, "I have been wasting your knowledge for years." She looked at him steadily. "You have been wasting it more than you know," she said, but there was something different in her voice now, something that was no longer about accusation but about the future. "You have my full attention for the next 30 years, Clarence. I suggest you use it better." He laughed, which was something he did rarely enough that she always noticed it when it happened, a real laugh without performance, coming from somewhere genuine. He picked up his tools and went back to work, and they planted the north pasture under the late spring sky with the mountains on the horizon and the Cimarron River silver in the distance. And it was one of the best days of Jane Conley Blackwell's life, and she knew it while it was happening, which she had learned was the particular gift of a life that had learned to pay attention. The sorghum came up green and even in June, and Clarence rode the fence line of the north pasture on a Saturday morning, looking at it with an expression that Jane, watching from the main house porch with her second cup of coffee, classified as the expression of a man returning to himself. The summer of 1888 was good. The ranch was in better condition than it had been in years, partly because the cessation of payments to Edward Maddox had freed up capital that could be properly invested, and Jane had opinions about those investments that were grounded in her knowledge of the land's capacity and her assessment of where the cattle market in New Mexico territory was trending. She had been watching the range conditions across the territory in her survey work for 7 years, and she understood patterns that were not visible to anyone who had stayed in one place, and she told Clarence what she saw, and he listened. They expanded the herd by 60 head that autumn, purchasing cattle from a ranch in Mora County that was downsizing. They improved the water retention on the east slope, using a technique that Jane had observed being used successfully in the Pecos Valley, modifying it for the conditions on Blackwell land. The hay yield from the north pasture in its first productive year was better than Clarence had hoped, and significantly better than any of the surrounding pastures given the drainage corrections. One evening in late October, sitting on the porch in the last warmth of the autumn sun, Clarence said, 4 years. Jane, who was reading a land survey report from a colleague who had sent it from Santa Fe because she had an opinion on his methodology and had said so in a letter, looked up. 4 years of that pasture sitting empty, he said. 4 years of loss that did not need to happen. No, she said, it did not need to happen. I keep calculating it, the yield we should have had. The capital I should not have spent. Stop calculating it, Jane said. He looked at her. It is over, she said. The accounting is done. What matters now is the next 4 years and the 4 after that. She paused, and I would note that the drainage correction we did this spring would have been done eventually regardless. The field is better for it now than it would have been if you had planted it without addressing the drainage in 1882. He was quiet for a moment. Are you finding a way to make it constructive? I am finding the truth, she said, which is that we are here, on productive land, with a good herd and a repaired pasture and a marriage that is, I believe, significantly stronger for having survived the last few months. The Maddox situation is resolved. The north pasture is planted. These are the facts. He reached across and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the late light with the mountains going purple and gold in the west and the north pasture green and actual below them. In the spring of 1889, Jane discovered she was expecting a child. She was not entirely surprised. She was not exactly prepared either, having spent 7 years constructing a life around her own mobility and capability, and not having given a great deal of specific thought to what parenthood would mean for the specific texture of that life. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she told Clarence, not out of anxiety about his reaction, but because she needed to understand her own reaction first. She told him on a Tuesday evening after dinner, straightforwardly, the way she told him everything now. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "Physically, yes. Otherwise, I am still deciding." "What are you deciding?" "Whether I can continue the survey work," she said. "During the pregnancy, after, what the arrangement will be." He nodded. He did not tell her what the arrangement would be. He did not tell her she would have to stop working or that the ranch would provide for everything or any of the other things that men in his position typically said in 1889 New Mexico territory when their wives told them they were expecting a child. He said, "What do you want to do?" Jane looked at him with something that was very close to love in its most unambiguous form. "I want to continue working through the spring and into the summer if I am able," she said. "I want to be here for the birth and for the first months. After that, I want to assess what is possible." "All right," he said. "There will need to be help in the house, someone reliable. We can afford that now," he said, and she heard the implicit acknowledgement in it, the reference to the resources that had been freed up by the end of the Maddox situation. "There is something else," she said. "Yes. I am not going to become someone else when this child arrives," she said. "I know that some people expect that. I need you to know it is not going to happen." Clarence looked at her across the table, and his expression was very clear and very steady. "Jane," he said, "I did not marry someone else. I married you. I do not want someone else." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Good," she said. She continued her survey work through June, adapting her methods as the pregnancy advanced and the work required adjustment, riding shorter distances, working from a base camp rather than continuously mobile, doing more of the calculation and drafting work and less of the hard physical field work. She was efficient about it in the way she was efficient about everything, which was completely. The baby was born in November 1889, delivered by the midwife in Cimarron with Clarence present because Jane had asked him to be, and he had been there without any of the awkwardness that might have been expected of a man of his era and temperament, steady and useful, and watching her with an attention that was, in the most difficult hours, the most anchoring thing in the room. It was a boy. They named him Robert after Jane's father. Robert Blackwell was a large, loud, thoroughly healthy infant who from his first days had an expression of intense concentration when examining new objects that Jane recognized immediately, and that made Clarence smile every time he observed it. The boy was curious about everything and afraid of nothing and had, from a very young age, an instinct for practical problems that was evident in the way he approached the physical world. Jane was, as she had anticipated, a different kind of mother than the territory expected. She was present and deeply attentive and fiercely devoted to Robert in a way that surprised no one who knew her, because everything Jane did she did completely. But she was not exclusively domestic, and when Robert was 6 months old she began taking limited survey contracts again, and when he was 14 months she returned to something close to her previous workload, with arrangements in place at the ranch that made this possible. The North Pasture produced well in 1889 and 1890 and every year after. The ranch expanded gradually and deliberately, with Jane's knowledge of the territory informing decisions about land and water that Clarence would not have been positioned to make alone, not because he lacked intelligence or capability, but because no single person working a single property could have the broader territorial knowledge that 7 years of survey work across the New Mexico high country had given Jane. Together, they were considerably more effective than either would have been alone. This was not an accident. It was the consequence of a specific thing that Clarence Blackwell had been rare enough to do from the very beginning, which was to look at a woman who was demonstrably excellent at something and feel not threatened by it but enlarged by it. In 1891, there was another development in the Maddox situation, though not the kind either of them had anticipated. A letter arrived from Clara Maddox herself, not from Edward. Clara wrote in a hand that was somewhat unsteady, and the letter was short. She said that she had become aware, through her brother, of the correspondence he had been conducting with the Blackwells, and that she had not known about it until recently and that she was ashamed of it. She said that she had no claim on Clarence Blackwell and had never believed she did, and that the arrangement between their fathers had been exactly that, an informal possibility between older men, and that she had long since made her peace with the fact that it had not come to anything. She said she hoped the Blackwells were well, and that she apologized for the trouble her brother had caused. She did not ask for anything. Jane read the letter twice and then handed it to Clarence. He read it and sat for a moment. "She sounds like a decent person," Jane said. "I think she is," he said. "Edward was the problem." "Edward was certainly a problem," Jane agreed. "But you also made certain choices." "Yes," he said. He folded the letter and set it on the desk. "Should we respond?" "I think we should," Jane said. "I will write it." She wrote back to Clara Maddox, a letter that was brief and kind and not more than was necessary, acknowledging the letter, accepting the apology for what it was, and wishing her well. There was a finality to it that was not unkind, simply accurate. It was the closing of a chapter that should have been closed 4 years earlier. They heard nothing more from either Maddox after that. Robert grew into a sturdy, observant child who followed his mother around the survey equipment, with a seriousness that made the field assistants she occasionally employed look slightly abashed. He could read a compass by the time he was 5, and had asked sufficiently coherent questions about the transit that Jane had begun explaining its function to him in real terms rather than simplified ones, because he clearly had the capacity for the real explanation. He also followed Clarence around the ranch with the same devotion, learning the cattle work and the land management with the absorption of a child who is being raised in the specific environment for which his nature is suited. By the age of 7, he was doing genuine work on the ranch, not child work designed to make him feel useful, but actual work that contributed to actual outcomes, and he was serious about it in a way that made the cowboys who worked the Blackwell Ranch treat him with an early respect that he carried well. In 1893, Jane discovered she was pregnant again. She told Clarence on a Wednesday morning over breakfast, with the same directness as the first time, and he received it with a calm joy that had none of the complexity of his response to Robert's impending arrival, because the terrain was familiar now, and he understood what it meant and what it did and did not change. This child was a girl, born in the winter of 1893 and named Alina, after no one in particular, but because Jane had always liked the name. Alina was smaller than Robert had been and considerably more demonstrative, with an emotional intelligence that was apparent from infancy, and that expressed itself, as she grew, in an extraordinary ability to read people and situations that made her either the most socially gifted or the most diplomatically dangerous person in any room. The family was complete in the way that felt organic rather than planned. 2 children who were entirely themselves and entirely products of the specific combination of people who had made them. One carrying Jane's precision and Clarence's physical capability. One carrying Jane's sharp assessment of human nature and Clarence's deep emotional reserves. The ranch continued to prosper. The North Pasture, in particular, became one of the most productive sections of the Blackwell operation, yielding consistently well because of the drainage work and the careful rotation that Jane had designed, and that Clarence implemented with his characteristic thoroughness. They became known in Colfax County not only as a successful ranch operation, but as one that was managed with an unusual intelligence, and other ranchers came periodically to ask Clarence about the methods, and he always told them, without reservation, that the land management decisions were joint decisions, which was not a common thing for a man to say in 1890s New Mexico territory, but which Clarence said without apparent consciousness of its unconventionality, because it was simply the truth. There was one incident in 1894 that became part of the story of the Blackwell Ranch in the way that certain events become part of stories, not because they were the largest thing that happened, but because they crystallized something that had been building for a long time. A neighboring rancher named Harlan Deer was having a significant problem with the water table on his south property, specifically with a spring that had been the primary water source for his south herd, and that was producing at a fraction of its previous volume. He had been dealing with this for 2 seasons and had tried several remedies that had not worked, and he rode over to the Blackwell Ranch on a September afternoon to talk to Clarence about it. Clarence listened to the description of the problem and then said, without any performance about it, "You should talk to Jane. She has spent more time assessing water sources across this county than anyone else I know." Harlan Deer had, like most men of his era, an instinctive resistance to this suggestion that was not personal and not even, precisely, conscious. But Clarence said it with such complete matter-of-factness that the resistance did not have much to hold on to, and Jane came out of the office where she was doing drafting work and listened to Harlan's description and asked him 6 questions, 2 of which he said he had not thought to consider. She rode out to his property the following Monday with her surveying equipment and spent the better part of a day assessing the water situation. And what she found was a compaction problem upstream from the spring source that was restricting the flow, a problem that was correctable with specific earthwork, and that would have continued to worsen if not addressed. She drafted a remediation plan and gave it to Harlan Deer with a straightforward explanation of the work required. Harlan Deer followed the plan. The spring recovered to full volume within 2 seasons. He came back to the Blackwell Ranch the following spring to report this, and he said to Jane, with a directness that had clearly cost him some adjustment in his understanding of the world, "I owe you a significant debt, Mrs. Blackwell. I would have lost that herd." "You do not owe me anything," Jane said. "It was the correct assessment. It would have been wasteful not to share it." But Harlan Deer told the story across Colfax County in the way that men tell stories that have shifted something in their perception, and the practical reputation that Jane Conley Blackwell had built through years of excellent survey work gained an additional dimension in those tellings that was specific to who she was and what she could do. Clarence heard these tellings secondhand, from the general store and the feed operation and the cattle auctions, and what he felt every time was something that he eventually identified with precision as the particular pride of a man who loves someone for exactly who they are and has the ongoing satisfaction of watching the world slowly discover what he has always known. Robert turned 12 in 1901 and asked his mother if she would teach him to use the transit. Jane spent 4 Saturday mornings that autumn teaching him the fundamentals of land surveying, and on the 4th Saturday he made a measurement that was, when verified, off by less than 1/10 of an inch. Jane verified it twice before commenting, and then she said, without any excess, "That is very good, Robert." He looked up at her with his concentrated expression, and she thought of a Sunday afternoon in 1881 standing at a displaced boundary stake, and felt the strange and beautiful continuity of things. Eleanor, at 8, had no interest in surveying and complete interest in the horses, which she was managing with an instinctive skill that had been apparent since she was small enough to be dangerous around them, and was now, at 8, developed enough that the cowboys who worked the ranch had stopped worrying about her around the stock and started watching her with the specific attention of people who are observing unusual natural ability. The 20th century came to Colfax County with less drama than it had been announced in the larger world. New Mexico Territory was still a territory, statehood some years distant still, and the range land issues and the political complications of the Maxwell land grant situation were not fully resolved, and there were still difficult years and hard seasons, and the ordinary weight of lives lived in a place that did not become comfortable simply because time had passed. But the Blackwell Ranch was solid. The North Pasture produced every year, rotating between sorghum and wheat and hay in the cycle that Jane had designed, and that had proven out over a decade of results. The herd was the right size for the land and the water and the management capacity available, a calculation that Jane had been refining for 15 years and that Clarence trusted absolutely because its record of accuracy was complete. They were, in 1902, 20 years past the dinner at the hotel restaurant in Cimarron where it had begun, and the specific gravity of who they were to each other had not diminished, but deepened in the way that things deepen when they are real enough to sustain the weight of actual living. One evening in the late spring of 1902, with the North Pasture green below the house and the mountains changing color in the long western light, Clarence found Jane standing at the fence line, the same fence line where he had asked her to marry him 2 decades before. She was looking at the pasture with an expression that he had learned to recognize, not the surveying assessment expression which was focused and energized, but the other one, the one that appeared when she was somewhere between memory and the present. He walked out and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Jane looked at the field for a moment more. "I am thinking," she said, "that the drainage correction we did in 1888 has held for 14 years without significant maintenance. That is better than I projected." He looked at her. "You are thinking about drainage," he said. She looked at him then, and there was something in her face that was not about drainage at all. That was about the specific and irreplaceable fact of standing at this fence line beside this person in this light, with the accumulated weight and warmth of 20 years of genuine life between them. "I am thinking about drainage," she agreed, "and some other things." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which was something she did only when she wanted to, and therefore always meant exactly what it appeared to mean. They stood at the North Pasture fence as the evening came down over the ranch, and the mountains went dark, and the stars came up over the Sangre de Cristo range the way they always had and always would, enormous and brilliant and indifferent in the way of large natural things. And the North Pasture was green and real and planted, and the house behind them was lit against the dark, and inside it there was the sound of their children, Robert's low voice and Aline's quick laughter, and the smell of the wood stove carrying out into the evening air. In 1903, Jane completed what would be her last major survey contract, a comprehensive boundary work in the Mora Valley that had been requested by the Territorial Land Office, and that represented, in its scope and complexity, a summation of everything she had learned and developed across more than 20 years of professional work. The report she produced was 340 pages long, meticulously documented, and included a set of topographic analyses that were, the Territorial Surveyor General said in his formal acknowledgment, the most comprehensive assessment of that region ever produced. She was 48 years old. She was not slowing down in any way that was visible to people who did not know her well. But she had been in correspondence with the Territorial Land Office for some time about a different kind of work, consulting rather than field work, advising on disputed claims and complex boundary situations from a base rather than riding the territory. And this transition felt less like a retreat than like a natural progression to the work that her accumulated knowledge made most possible. She kept her surveying equipment, of course. It would have been unthinkable otherwise. Robert, at 14, had become a serious student of the land in both his parents' senses, carrying his mother's technical capability and his father's instinct for the practical management of it. And the conversations at the Blackwell dinner table in those years were the kind of conversations that happened in a household where intelligence was the baseline expectation, and where everyone was expected to contribute something real. Aline, at 10, was already the best rider in Colfax County for her age, and had opinions about the horse breeding program at the ranch that were, upon examination, entirely correct, and which Clarence had incorporated into the breeding decisions with the same naturalness that he incorporated Jane's land management observations, because he was a man who had learned, early and well, that good thinking was worth following regardless of its source. One evening in the autumn of 1904, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, Jane said to Clarence, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from the ranch accounts. "The morning I asked you about the North Pasture," she said. "Do you know why I asked it then?" "I have wondered," he said. "I had been looking at the survey maps from the original 1881 boundary work," she said. "I pulled them out to check something for the Mora Valley contract, and I looked at the North Pasture notation in my original field notes where I had written about the drainage and the planting potential. And I saw that I had written in the margin in my own hand from 1882 that the North Pasture should yield well in a good season with the drainage corrected. And I realized I had never seen a crop in that field, not in 20 years of coming and going from this ranch." She paused, and I knew something was wrong. I had known something was wrong for a long time, actually. I had felt the shape of it without knowing the content, and that morning I simply decided to ask. Clarence was very still. "You knew something was wrong," he said. "Not what, but yes, the shape of it, the way you were around that pasture, the way you did not talk about it." She met his eyes. "I should have asked earlier, that is my own accounting." "You asked when you asked," he said. "I did," she said, "and you told me." "Eventually," he said. "Eventually," she agreed. There was a quality in the silence between them that was the settled and specific quality of two people who have had the same conversation in many forms over many years and have arrived, through that repetition and through everything else, at a genuine peace with the full truth of what they are to each other. "I have not thanked you properly for the letter to Maddox," Clarence said. "I do not know if I ever have." "You do not need to." "I want to." He looked at her steadily. "What you did that day, sitting down in that office and reading everything and writing that letter in 2 hours. I have thought about it many times, what it would have taken from someone else. What it cost you, given everything." Jane considered this. "It cost me nothing professionally," she said. "I had the knowledge and it was applicable. What it cost me personally was more complicated, but the alternative was letting it continue, which was more costly." "You were angry," he said. "I was very angry," she said. "I am still, occasionally, a little angry, about the lost years of the pasture and about the lost information and about the choice being taken from me." She looked at him without evasion. "But I am not angry at you as a person. I am angry at the situation, and you are not the situation." He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had taken her hand at the fence line in the spring of 1888, and held it with the same quality of deliberate and knowing care. "I love you, Jane," he said. "I have loved you since you looked up from your transit in 1881 and told me I was a quarter inch off." She looked at him with something in her face that was warm and clear and entirely without pretense. "I know you do," she said. "I loved you somewhat after that. Possibly when you helped me load the equipment onto the mule without being asked. You handled it correctly." "The equipment." "The equipment," she confirmed, and there was a smile in her voice that she did not always let reach her face but was letting reach it now. He laughed, and she let herself laugh too, and the kitchen was warm and the night was outside and the North Pasture was in the dark below the house, deep green and productive, and putting down its roots in the corrected earth. In 1905, Robert turned 16 and began working the ranch with Clarence on a serious basis, taking on a portion of the management responsibilities that he was ready for, and that freed Clarence for the longer-term planning work that the ranch's continued expansion required. Robert had Clarence's physical capability and his mother's precision, and he was developing a quality of judgment that was his own, grounded and observant. And the Blackwell Ranch under 3 Blackwells was becoming something more significant than any one of them alone. Eleanor, at 12, had begun asking Jane questions about the surveying work with a seriousness that surprised them both. Not the technical questions that Robert had asked at 12, but the questions about the political and legal dimensions of the work, about the land disputes and the injustices of the Maxwell land grant situation, and the way that native Pueblo land claims had been handled by the territorial government, which was badly and dishonestly in ways that Jane had documented and had opinions about that she did not soften when Alina asked. She told Alina what she knew and what she had seen. She told her about the Jicarilla Apache people who had been on the land in this region long before any of the grants and surveys and disputes, about the specific injustices of the late 19th century that she had witnessed, not from outside, but from inside the machinery of the land documentation system, and about the gap between what the law said and what the law did that she had spent 20 years navigating. She told her these things because Alina asked, and because Alina was 12 and serious and deserved the real answers. Alina listened with her father's quality of complete attention and her mother's quality of unsparing assessment, and she said, at the end of a long conversation one winter evening, someone should do something about that. Jane looked at her daughter. Yes, she said, someone should. In 1908, New Mexico Territory was still 5 years from statehood, and the work of the land in Colfax County continued as it always had, season by season, crop by crop. The North Pasture producing, and the herd growing, and the Blackwell family working the land they had built and rebuilt again through the specific effort of two people who had told each other the truth, and continued to tell each other the truth, and had found in that truth something more durable than anything that could have been built on the alternative. Jane Conley Blackwell was 53 years old in 1908, and was, by any reasonable assessment, at the height of her professional reputation. The consulting work she had transitioned to had proven to be exactly what the Territorial Land Office needed, not because field surveyors were scarce, but because the kind of comprehensive analytical intelligence that Jane brought to complex disputed claims was genuinely rare. She had worked on 47 cases in 5 years, and her analysis had been determinative in 31 of them, and had contributed materially to the resolution of the remainder. She still rode out to the ranch's own land regularly, not for professional purposes, but because the land was hers and she wanted to know it, and because, standing at the boundary lines of the Blackwell property, with the instrument she had carried for 30 years still gave her the specific and irreducible satisfaction of the work itself. The morning conversations at the breakfast table had become, over the years, the clearest expression of how they were together. Not the large moments, the plantings and the births and the resolved crises, but the breakfast table, where Jane drank her coffee and Clarence ate in his methodical way, and they talked about the day's work and the season's plans and the children's progress and whatever else was in their minds, and the information moved between them in both directions with the ease of people who have been having the same conversation for 25 years and have made it better with each iteration. In the spring of 1910, Jane was looking at her field notes from the original 1881 survey one morning, the same notes she had pulled out for the Mora Valley contract 6 years before, and she found a page she had forgotten. It was a note she had made on her first day on the Blackwell property in the autumn of 1881, before she had met Clarence, when she had ridden past the North Pasture on her way to the disputed boundary line. She had stopped and looked at the pasture and made a notation in her characteristic clear hand. North Pasture, excellent soil composition, drainage issues correctable, significant yield potential unrealized. Owner should be advised. She had, it appeared, identified the situation before she had met the man. She showed the page to Clarence at breakfast. He read it and sat for a moment. 1881, he said, October, before we had spoken. He looked up at her with an expression that was part amusement and part something deeper. You saw it before anything else, he said. I saw the land, she said. I always see the land first. And then what did you see? She picked up her coffee cup and looked at him with the direct and warm and entirely characteristic gaze that was one of the things he had loved first and had never stopped loving. "A man who was off by a quarter inch," she said, "and who knew it." He reached across the table and she met his hand with hers, and the kitchen was exactly as it had been for 28 years, warm and particular and their own. And outside the window the north pasture was beginning to show the first green of the spring planting, the soil dark and turned and ready, as it would be every spring from now on, doing exactly what it was capable of doing in the corrected and tended and genuinely productive earth. The mountains were unchanged on the western horizon, Sangre de Cristo, blood of Christ, named by men who had come through this land long ago with their own secrets and their own silences and their own unresolved reckonings. And the land had absorbed all of it and continued, as land does, past every human drama and every human failure and every human recovery, enduring and indifferent and generous to those who bothered to understand it. Jane Conley Blackwell understood it. She had always understood it. And she had brought that understanding to a man who had the intelligence and the rarity of character to let it change him. And in the changing they had built something that the north pasture below the house expressed more clearly than any other word. Something that had been fallow and was now, finally and permanently, productive. Something that had the deep root system of everything that had been spoken and the clean drainage of everything that had been cleared, and that would yield, season after season, in the good and tended earth of a life that had been built with the only materials that hold: truth, and the courage, however delayed and however costly, to finally say it. Robert Blackwell married in 1912, a woman named Frances who was a schoolteacher in Cimarron, and who had, to Jane's private and significant satisfaction, opinions about land management that she was not shy about sharing, and which Robert listened to with the easy respect of a man raised in a household where such things were the natural order. They built a house on the eastern section of the Blackwell Ranch property and worked the land alongside Clarence and Jane. And the Blackwell Ranch in the second decade of the 20th century was a multi-generational operation that had grown from the thing Thomas Blackwell had started, and that Clarence had nearly lost in the hard early years, and that Jane's knowledge and capability had helped shape into something more durable than either of them could have created alone. Eleanor, who surprised no one who knew her, became in 1915 the first woman appointed to the New Mexico State Land Office, the state having finally come into being in 1912. And she brought to that position the same quality of unsparing intelligence and the same deep knowledge of the territory's land and its injustices that she had been developing since she was 12 years old, asking her mother the real questions. She worked specifically on cases involving Pueblo land claims, doing the documentation work that was as close to justice as the available systems allowed. And she was good at it in the specific way that a person is good at work that is also a vocation. Clarence Blackwell lived to see all of this. He was, in 1915, 65 years old and still working the ranch with a physical capability that men 20 years younger respected and occasionally envied, though the deep lines in his face and the silver in his dark hair told the honest story of 40-plus years of outdoor work in the New Mexico high country. He worked alongside Robert, now more as a partner than a director, and the transition had been natural because it had been built on 20 years of the elder training the younger in all honesty. He and Jane were 50 years old apart in age from each other in that even way of people born close together, she 59 and he 65. And they moved through their days with the particular ease of people who have been genuinely known by another person for a long time. There was nothing soft or managed about how they talked to each other. Jane was still direct and Clarence was still steady, and they still disagreed, periodically, about specific decisions involving the ranch or the children or the work. And the disagreements were conducted with the same honest efficiency as everything else between them. Frances brought a grandson into the world in 1913, a boy they named Thomas after Clarence's father, and Robert and Frances would have 2 more children in the years that followed. And the Blackwell name on the land in Colfax County had the deep root system of 3 generations and the specific history of the people who had built it, honestly and imperfectly and durably. On a morning in the autumn of 1916, Jane woke early and lay for a moment in the familiar dark of the bedroom she had been sleeping in for 34 years, listening to Clarence's steady breathing beside her, and to the first birds in the cottonwood trees along the creek, and to the beginning of the ranch day moving in the distances beyond the window. She thought, as she sometimes did in those early morning moments, about the girl who had ridden into Cimarron in the spring of 1881 with a transit and a measuring chain, and a complete and self-sufficient understanding of how to navigate the world alone. That girl had not been wrong about herself. She had not been wrong about her capabilities or her independence or the value of the work she could do. She had simply not known yet that all of that could coexist with this, that being fully and exactly yourself was not, as she had once understood it, incompatible with allowing another person to know you entirely. She had learned that at a breakfast table, asking about a fallow field, and hearing the answer that had been too long in coming but had come at last, complete and undefended and real. She turned her head and looked at Clarence in the morning dark. He was already awake. He was looking at the ceiling with the particular quality of early morning thought that she recognized as different from the thoughtfulness of the rest of his day, more open, less organized, closer to something. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned his head and looked at her. 1881, he said. She looked at him. "A survey stake," he said. 14¼ inches northeast of where it was supposed to be. Jane looked at him in the morning dark of the bedroom of the ranch house on the plateau above the Cimarron River, with the north pasture green and planted in the distance below, and the mountains changing color in the first light. 14¼ inches, she said. "You are still off by 1/4 inch." "I know," he said. And the light came through the window and the day began, the way it always had, and the ranch was alive around them, and everything that needed to be said between them had been said, and everything that needed to be planted had been planted, and it grew.